Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the end of week 13, essentially for us, with just two classes this week with Easter break. I want to go over, before we get into just a little bit, just to get you ready for next week going into chapter 20 on exercise prescription. I want to kind of tie together chapters 17 to 19 for exercise physiology for us. I know a few of you actually expressed interest in doing your papers on children in particular and or progression in terms of any terms of training, prescription, or variables that relate to training children, adolescents, or even as people go into becoming older adults. So this is kind of a little chart that, and I'll put it on Blackboard for you as well. It's not, by no means is it comprehensive or perfect, but it's just kind of got some quick little visuals kind of reminding you of certain little things to kind of keep your brain wrapped around some concepts, because there's some variability, of course, when someone becomes an adult versus adolescence, because the puberty is not exact with every single person. When you're actually termed an older adult varies across the board depending upon whether you're talking about declining factors physiologically, whereby that can occur in the 20s, right? Where most people think of older adults as 55 and above, because that's the technical term for older adult, 55 and older. I'm not yet an older adult, 49, not there yet. That said, by some standards, I am, because there's declining factors for me, generally speaking. Certainly not the same physiologically as I was 25 plus, 30 plus years ago. That said, getting a few things kind of clarified, or at least thinking about them, I should say, so much clarified. We've talked about these concepts, but for age, boys and girls, generally referred to as children, I should say children, not just boys and girls, but the children here are 10, basically 1 to 10. Infant being under 1, toddler, technically, this is like 2 and 3, and then, or maybe even really 1 to 2, more for toddlers, and then they're a kid or a child after that. So you can even take toddlers into that too. But that said, children about age 10, and that's about where you start to get some separation in terms of puberty for boys, kind of begins somewhere in that time frame, whereby adolescence referred to like 11 years and above. 10 years is where you start to see some slight separation, which is about fifth grade, fourth grade, I should say, fifth grade, where you start to see some separation where the boys start to grow a little bit to catch up with, in a lot of cases, where the girls are ahead. That being said, and adolescence comes after that, which can be up to age 22, all depending. And then the men and the women, somewhere around age 23, could be a little earlier, could be probably not later, but somewhere. So we said 23 and older, essentially, for men and women, and older men and older women. Even though technically that age would really be 55 and above for an older adult, I put 40 on here because that seems to be when some of the most significant factors start to see decline. Doesn't mean the end of the world. And I've had students before kind of go, "Oh my gosh, this is more than I can handle because I don't want to become old." Start looking at all these factors whereby you could see how everything has fallen apart. I'm like, well, no, but yes, there is some decline. That being said, when we're talking about height, your 50% of your height is basically going to be in the first 2 years, right? And then adult body weight, or about 50% of adult body weight is at about 10 years, about half your weight. That's not always true, but it's a fairly reasonable indicator of what you're going to be in about 7 to 10 or so years. And then you have the same happening for the children, or for the girls, roughly speaking, about that time frame. Okay, could be slight variations in there. And then as far as height goes, max height for the boys is around 14 or pretty close to it. Girls is around 12 and a half or so, 12 and a half. And then weight is about somewhere around 14, 15 is the weight where they peak, so to speak, before doing physical activity and for engaging in other things. So it says peak, and it really could be more likely to peak. I'm sorry, weight gain is to be more closer to 20 years, whereas height peak more towards 14. I was hedging and hawing there for a second because I was looking at 14. You're not going to stop growing at 14 weight-wise. That said, height-wise for the girls is, just before 13 a lot of cases. Not always, but a lot of cases it is. So by 8th grade, they're full height in most situations, whereas boys could be growing height-wise still possibly another year or two after that. There's some variation there, about a couple years difference regardless for boys versus girls in height. And then weight gain peaks similarly for girls as well, somewhere around the early college years equivalent wise, or just a year or two after 18. And then height reduction can begin around around age 35, 40 for men and women because of compressed discs, usually because of poor postures, like maybe how I'm sitting right now. It's kind of hard to remind myself to sit completely upright. There's only so much you can do. There's so many factors that we take into account for help people sit up more tall, sit more upright, more of a neutral spine. When the fact of the matter is, when your hips are flexed in a passive position and you're sitting in a chair, it's very difficult to even maintain that on a regular basis. That being said, you really should use the backrest. Most people sit up in their chair a little bit. That's actually the worst thing you can do. You want to have your back supported while you sit in that chair, even though perfect world would rather have you standing up and not seated much of your day. That being said, expecting to gain 20 plus pounds above the teen years by the time the early 20s and mid 20s are hitting. That's pretty reasonable to expect, that about 20-ish pounds. Not true of everybody. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's much more, all depending on activity and diet, lifestyle, all those things, right? And of course, we see height and weight loss dramatic around age 80 plus. Height more now because tissues are becoming necrotic, getting what we call creep, whereby you get a lot of the anterior tissues actually pulling, because most people are not more reclined type positions. They're more rounded forward into more flexion for the most part. So consequently, you tend to see more of that kind of posture predominantly for older adults, particularly after age 80. Significant declines come at that time. And that's actually said, it's actually mentioned a little bit more in terms of strength coming down through here. We're actually, when we talked, I had it down here somewhere, there it is. The ability to stand declining at around age 50, okay? Whereby there's a significant decline. Actually, the book notes about a 10% drop off after age 20. Like, that's the typical person. If they're not athletic, they have more and more difficulty getting up from a chair. By my age now at 49, I should be having significant difficulty, and you should be expecting to see me push off the armrest to get up and whatnot. Thankfully, I don't have to do that yet, but that will happen if I don't keep regularly active, okay? We start gaining muscle mass. The children's muscle mass is about 25% body weight at birth for both boys and girls, but the girls' total mass is about 10% less body weight wise. Total body mass, body weight is about 10% less than males at birth. And then the peak for the boys' muscle mass is around 18 or so. It's about 45% of their body weight by that time. And a lot of it's because of testosterone. Right? That's why it's more than the girls, which is about 35% of their body weight at around 16 to 20, or 18 to 25, I should say, for the boys. Okay. That's not terribly surprising what we know with testosterone differences between males to females. And then men and women, as far as muscle mass, there's so much variability here depending upon what their activity level is. But that said, there's definitely muscle mass tends to be held for longer periods, meaning you don't see as much of a decline that way. It's actually easier to maintain, and a lot of times strength can be maintained, muscle mass and strength, for much into the later years, 50, 60 years old plus. 70, it's a little tougher then, and 80, big drop off. I think of like Clint Eastwood, for if you're familiar with him, for an age gap here. You don't see as much of him in the movies now, but old movies, he was the guy for a lot of the westerns, a lot of the action movies and whatnot, at least one of them. And he'd been known to doing tons, basically double-digit pull-ups into his 70s. Now he's in his 80s, and it's a significant drop-off. It's interesting to see that exact thing with him, who's kind of different than the norm, way ahead of the curve as far as his activity level. And about 3% or greater starts to decline more rapidly after age 80 with muscle mass. Bone mass, bones, muscles, and tissues are getting longer during childhood and into adolescence, right? And they begin to fuse somewhere around the 12 years old for the boys. Peak for the around 12 years old, and actually they'll fuse more like 18 to 21 for the boys, whereas the girls will begin to fuse around 12, and they'll peak pretty much till about, they won't peak so much, they'll kind of gradually grow. Boys tend to do more of a growth spurt, specifically around 12, whereas the girls, it's more of a gradual growth process. And then that said, the peak for bone mass for boys or men is around 35 to 40 years old. I put that in the men category. It could be almost older men, but still, that's good news for the boys. A little earlier for the girls. It doesn't mean you can't maintain muscle mass. You just don't tend to see increases past about 30. Approaching into 40s, somewhere in there is typically where you see menopause. And that, of course, will affect hormonally women significantly and make it that much more difficult to maintain bone density and muscle mass, although it's certainly possible. It's just more difficult, right? Decline after 50 years for bone mass becomes significant, where it's very noticeable, and for the women it's more towards 40. Again, more toward because of menopause. Okay, fat-free mass. Males tend to be very similar to females in the early years, 10 to 12%, I should say the very early years, the first year, 10 to 12% at birth, okay? But then we start getting into more adolescence. As we move towards adolescence, it gets closer to 15% of the body weight fat-wise for the boys, 25% for the females, right? And of course, you can expect to gain 5-10% plus body fat percentage-wise as we get into our 20s even. Easily, unless regular activity is kept. These numbers are not based on someone being significantly active. They're based on the average person, right? That's key. So the things that are not as good of factors, we can expect to be probably cut in half or better. And the factors that are good factors, we potentially can see them be significantly higher than they're showing here. That said, basically, again, still looking at 5-10% plus above the teen years for fat mass increase that goes into perpetuity as we get older, because muscle mass is declining. Consequently, the mass you gain is going to be pretty much fat, unless, again, someone's regularly active during their later years. Nervous system. We talked about myelination occurring most rapidly at the childhood years, early years. However, it continues all the way into sexual maturity for that 17 to 21 average time frame for the boys, around basically 12 to 15 for the girls. It doesn't mean that myelination stops happening, though. We say it actually maximizes and actually still can keep happening well into our basically, although it'll happen, the progress wanes. Better way of putting it. It's not going to be growing to the rate that it was to sexual maturity. But if you're continuing to do new things, continuing to do different exercises, different motions, same goes your brain, utilizing your brain in different ways, myelination around nerve fibers will continue. That will continue to occur. And that's one of the fears with dementia and Alzheimer's from a brain perspective is failure to use brain neurons, effectively the nerve fibers dying, and then that obviously losing brain capacity and affecting all sorts of factors. That's also true for physiological factors for muscle, right? You cannot travel that impulse more or less, and you become incapable of traveling that impulse, period, or the neuron attaches basically to other fibers, trying to use those fibers with other new neurons, to the same fibers. If that didn't happen, those fibers die as well, okay? And that has to be related to activity. If you engage in activity, tissue becomes more necrotic and less like muscle tissue, more like connective tissue. Muscle tissue can actually become like connective tissue. Strength, there aren't a lot of studies for children when it comes to actual strength, probably for good reason. We're not going to be doing it too much for the kids, although we want them to be engaging in activity, moving as much as possible, gradually increasing challenges, not really worrying about adding multiple sets of things until they get to like 9-10 years old. Start talking about 11-12. Then you can do a couple, 2-3 sets, and maybe some intervals of light activity things, not like loading them up heavily, but just doing some basic exercises. We don't want to be talking about significant loading until age 13 and 14. Doesn't mean you can't give a kid a weight, something heavy to carry around. It's not the same thing. Not necessarily wanting to overload them, but to be really clear, that's all dependent upon so much variability of someone's individual capabilities, what they have in their background, their genetic capacity, all that stuff, okay? But the peak for strength is around 20 to 30 years old for the men, the boys, adolescent boys, and it's actually around 20 years. It stops right around 20, like early college years, late high school, for the girls if they're not regularly engaging in significant activity. That can be different, but that said, hormones play a role again there. The strength for the men, 10% decline per decade after age about 40 to 50. And that continues, where again, standing ability even actually gets difficult for 50 years old and above for both men and women, but the decline begins earlier for strength, along with muscle mass and bone mass for women, generally speaking. Blood pressure is lower for children. They have less peripheral resistance from blood flow perspective. Remember, things that affect blood flow in general are pressure, resistance, and flow. And in this case, blood flow, having peripheral resistance, having basically less dilation of arteries. So there's actually, less constriction of arteries. So there actually is more free flow of blood over time. Artery diameter can decrease if those pathways aren't traveled with a regular basis long term, and they're going to decrease no matter what at a certain point in aging, especially as we get toward our 40s, 50s, and older. We're going to have greater peripheral resistance, less blood flow freely to the tissues, the periphery, the limbs. So consequently, you're going to have a decrease in strength capacity, not just because of bone mass, muscle mass loss, but also because of less blood flow to those areas. Okay. And increased resistance actually begins somewhere in the 20s, all dependent upon activity and whatnot. The peak is often noted as early 20s for the men and mid-teens for the women. However, there are the top-level athletes, you don't see them peaking at that time. They peak several years to a decade plus later sometimes. That said, heart rate. Due to the smaller size of children's hearts, they have to beat at a higher rate, just like small mammals in general. You see a much faster rate for smaller animals, right? Less blood flow per beat, smaller bodies, consequently a higher heart rate. Resting heart rate for boys, adolescents, around 45 to 50, girls 55 to 60, and the average is around 70, 75 though. That's athletic, 45 to 50 for the boys. Adolescents, and 55 to 65 for the girls at adolescents, but much higher if they're not athletic. And then start to see a decrease in heart rate, basically from a standpoint of more training heart rate, not necessarily resting heart rate, but certainly training heart rates, no question about it, or during exertion by 0.5 beats per minute per year, starting in the 20s, okay, about 25 or so, and that continues. Stroke volume is also lower due to the small heart and less total blood volume for the children. You're looking at about 70 to 80 milliliters per beat on average for the boys, 60 to 70 milliliters per beat on average for the women because they're smaller than the men. And of course, can maximize about 150 milliliters per beat for the elite type males at that age range, and for the adolescent girls about 110. So you start to see some significant drop-offs from a standpoint of variation between men and women on average, okay, on average. And of course, that's still true, those same levels from basically adolescence into early adulthood, whereby similar numbers are still there, but you can see a decline, start getting into somewhere around 30, 40-ish, okay, 30-ish really, possibly as much as a 10 to 20% decline in stroke volume because of left ventricular size decline, mass decline, less thick of the walls because they've not been using that heart regularly with regular cardiovascular exercise, arterial stiffening, so you actually have less blood flow, more peripheral resistance, so less efficient blood flow, none of those things being good. Some of that will happen no matter what. That decline can be greatly attenuated, greatly reduced with regular activity. The lungs, the ventilation max is about 40 liters per minute, around 46 years old, a little bit lesser for the girls. And of course, that ventilation max can be more than double that, even more than triple that at adolescence with proper regular training. That's similar to the boys in terms of progression. However, it's still slightly smaller than lower than the boys, again, due to body mass, due to body size differences. So assuming a similar body size, you might see the potential capacity for a similar ventilation max, okay? And that said, elasticity of the lungs declines after about age 35. The capacity peak is unchanged. That's true of the adulthood as well. The capacity of the lungs is unchanged. However, ventilation max is now reduced to 70 liters per minute, now looking closer and closer to about just a little late, like almost like when you're back to 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old again in this time frame, right? Assuming someone's not regularly active. But the easiest thing to lose is your aerobic capacity, your VO2 max, lactate threshold, all those things, whereas your muscle mass and strength are easier to maintain in later years. That VO2 max, again, not many studies for the children on that, peaks around age 17 to 21, and a little earlier for the girls. 10% decline per decade after age 25 for VO2 max aerobic capacity, and it continues and actually increases to about more like 20% above age 80. That wasn't noted on here. Anaerobic capacity, the reason why children have the inability to be able to go at high intensities for longer numbers of sets and repeated efforts, let alone for even 2 and 3 efforts sometimes, is because they have 50 to 60% muscle glycogen. And actually what's not on here, less red blood cells, less hemoglobin, right, by a lot than adults, probably 50, 60% less hemoglobin as well. And so the peak anaerobic capacity, though, happens around maturity, similar age ranges, 17 to 21 for the boys, 12 to 15 for the girls. And that slight decline will happen from a standpoint of both muscle glycogen stores as well as hemoglobin content, so red blood cells, affecting this as well. Lactate clearance becomes more difficult in these later years, so that becomes a challenge for needing greater time for recovery, and that's again studying more average people though, and that lactate threshold will become higher as a relative level of VO2 max, especially the older we get, because we're losing VO2 max, but then we can maintain our lighter abilities for long enough, but the actual VO2 max is going to be declining. So you'll see a higher lactate threshold percentage-wise, which might give you the wrong idea that you're necessarily improving when in fact it's because of decline of VO2 max. And that's because for someone who's the average person doing some training, not necessarily a lot. Now, ATP-CP, that basic maximal output for type 2X muscle fibers maintains pretty late in life to at least the 40-somethings for the women, 50-somethings for the men, all the way through here. And we have these capacities, and actually could be much longer than that. That's one of the things that actually maintains fairly similarly through good 40, 50, 60 years of life. Okay. Maximal anaerobic power, however, we talk about maximal power. This is a good actually recognition here of seeing how power varies from a standpoint of, this was a Wingate test on a bike, which is not necessarily the most indicative of power as a whole, but it gives us some good ideas for everyone, from what expectations for children versus adolescents versus adults versus older adults. 310 watts for the boys somewhere in the 7 to 10 year old really, and then the 260 for the girls, about 20% below the boys at this point, pre-puberty even. Then 520 watts, now we're getting a pretty good jump there for the boys, and 370, girls went up as well, but now they're 40% below the boys for maximal anaerobic power. And of course, now they continue to be about 40%-ish, even going into the adult years. That's the average. You probably can expect to see that cut down by half, or maybe a little bit more than half, and even probably as much as probably also cutting that down to but only about 10-15% difference from the girls to the boys. If you are talking about elite type athletes, you will see fairly similar numbers within 10-15%, maybe 20%. All depending upon the sport and the athletes. Thermal stress, there's greater surface area to body mass for children, which makes them much more susceptible to heat, in fact, and cold, both. Okay, and that's also now both children and older adults are susceptible to cold. However, the older adults much prefer the heat. They don't have the issue of the greater surface area to mass now. They're full grown, although losing some height, losing some body mass. There's now a loss of cutaneous vasoconstriction. So consequently, your skin can't constrict and protect you when it's cold out as well. So consequently, they're very cold sensitive. And that's why a lot of older adults prefer warmer climates, warmer temperatures, prefer warmer rooms, which can be really aggravating if you're younger and don't want to be in the sitting around and you're moving around and they want 80 degrees in the house, and you're trying to move around a little bit, can get pretty difficult. But that's something that might not be their choice. However, that said, it's also due to metabolic rate decline. So if regular activity is engaged, then there won't be such a significant difference there in sensitivity to cold, even though there will be that lack of cutaneous or loss of cutaneous vasoconstriction. There will not be much of an issue of decline of metabolic rate. Regular activity will play a great role with that, and that's very important for us to remember. I just want to quickly look, without spending overly significant time here, at our concepts that we have for next week. Talk a little more with exercise readiness. Things I want you thinking about. What's the primary tool for assessing exercise readiness? Are adults smarter than kids when it comes to exercise? I'm not so sure about that. We'll come back to that. And here's a good question for you too. Basically, what should be the defining difference, do you think, in participating as a male versus a female athlete in sport? And to me, the defining difference is, to be really clear, is individual responses. Just because on average men perform at a higher level in pretty much every area of physiological performance than do women, with the exception of being static strength for avoidance of fatigue. Some relative to body mass, women will perform better than men. And of course, when body mass, as far as muscle mass and cross-sectional area are similar, women tend to perform as well as men. So the assumption could be made, if training is enhanced early enough and frequently enough and properly enough, then you can see some pretty similar results from men and women, to a certain extent at least, barring testosterone, which is going to be a limiting factor the higher they get toward elite type level performances. But rather than worrying about whether we're talking about a male versus a female, from a standpoint of capacity for handling stress, it really should be based upon the person in front of you or the group in front of you. On exercise readiness in general, we'll talk about this in a little more detail next week, but we'll talk about medical clearance and need to have every 3 to 5 years for 39 or younger, every 2 to 3 years for age 40, 49, every other year over age 50, and you need to be more frequently because of the need to have regular checks to be assured nothing's going wrong. We want to make sure nothing's going wrong, and there's less concern when you're 39 or younger, a little more concern when you're 40 and older. And the research says when you're 50 or older, the probability of you having some of these risks increases dramatically with age, history of myocardial infarction, smoking, blood pressure increases, dyslipidemia, blood cholesterol, fasting glucose levels, obesity, being sedentary. We're going to talk about these in more detail next week. And that said, the prescription, I'll talk about this in detail, but you'll have it all here at least. For children and adolescents, 60 plus minutes per day. Not surprising, we talked about that. Mostly moderate or vigorous. And 3 days of vigorous activity weekly and 3 days strength training. That's fair. Adults, 150 plus minutes weekly, which actually is a big drop off from what is essentially 420 here. So that's minimum. This is minimum. This really should be so much more. I never have been happy about the standards they put out for adults, but it's difficult, and they got to find a way to put it into their lives, which is difficult. Me too. But the problem is that's the whole thing. It's become the norm to not find a way to get exercise in, or you're crazy, weird if you get too much exercise in versus the rest of us, so to speak, when people think about it that way, who have lives. Like, well, got to find the balance, right? That said, strength training 2+ days a week, and significant benefits are reached when reaching more like 300 moderate minutes, 150 of the vigorous minutes, right? Big jump. We'll talk about that. Older adults, same as adult, avoiding inactivity and perhaps focusing on balance, because balance is a concern for falling and hurting themselves when they get older. Okay. Again, I'm going through this fast. I want to get your brain thinking about it, so when we do talk about it next week, this stuff starts to resonate better. We'll talk about mode, the type of exercise you pick, something you enjoy, walking versus running, cycling, rowing, swimming, strength training possibilities. We'll talk about variations there and tools you might use. How often should you train? U.S. Department of Health and Human Services info. We'll talk about that. Duration per set, intensity, frequency, intensity, duration, right? Warming up, how often, why you should do it for 10 minutes. Goal specific, if it's hot or cold, what do you do? When do you stretch? The cool down itself, and that stuff we will talk about next week. You got 18 plus days left. No more labs. I mean, yeah, you got a lab. The lab next week is going to be essentially related to, actually, there is no lab next week, I don't think. I think I have a light lab for you. It's going to be really light, and I may even cancel the lab. I might even cancel the lab for you, okay? We'll see how it goes next week. I'll make it either really light or I'll cancel it for you. And then what I call labs after that are essentially your peer review of your paper, of your classmate's paper. It's really going to be your lab for the by the last week there. And then after that, that's it. Okay, so there's really no more labs. You got regular discussion board posts, you got a paper, and you got a project. And that project is basically designing a program, right, for both untrained and trained individuals, and talking about variation, how you train someone over a period of a given year, and giving charts and visual breakdowns of how you progress them through that. And then, of course, your exam, which I'm going to, again, give you a prep sheet to prepare you for that. And a large majority of you did very well between the low to mid 80s to mid 90s, with few exceptions. If you go through that prep sheet, I'm not going to have it turned in this time. It's not going to turn it in, just for your usage. I'm giving you the questions again. Okay, trying to make it easier on you for that. You got to get that. We got to do a good project and a good paper, and otherwise you're going to keep up that normal basic work for only a little bit longer here. I gave you till May 1st, even though technically your final would have been on the 29th, 2 days before. Not because I want you to turn it in on May 1st. I want you to turn it as soon as you can, but you do not have to do it until May 1st. I'm giving you more time. So I'm giving you through finals week all the way to the end of it to do any work you need. If you don't want to do that, fantastic. Get it all done by April 24th, or heck, whatever, April 18th. I don't care when you do it. It's all out there for you, okay? I'll make sure it's all out there for you. I'm going to double check that between today and tomorrow, and it will all be clear for you, okay? Otherwise, I wish you well. Have a great Easter break. Take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.